The Dark Scrolls. Bodies were inspected like evidence. Love was replaced by law. And one wrong breath could cost you your head. You're about to step into the most private room in Tudor history, the royal bedchamber of Henry VIII. A place where desire was weaponized, privacy didn't exist, and the first night of marriage was treated like a courtroom trial. Forget everything you think you know about royal romance, because inside these gilded walls, sex wasn't an act of love. It was a state performance, an obligation, a test of loyalty that could decide whether a queen lived or died. History books tell you about Henry's 6 wives, the beheadings, the divorces, the politics. But what they don't tell you is that every royal wedding night was a public investigation, supervised by servants, physicians, and priests. It wasn't passion, it was procedure. When a Tudor king took a bride, the entire kingdom demanded proof that the marriage had been consummated, not assumed, not whispered, proven. Within hours of the ceremony, the royal couple would be escorted to the marriage bed by an audience of nobles. Yes, escorted, often with cheering, laughter, and the ringing of silver goblets. What was supposed to be a moment of intimacy was turned into a spectacle of statehood. The door would close, but privacy stopped there. Because outside that door, servants and guards waited, instructed to listen for the sounds of consummation. The rustle of sheets, a muffled cry, a groan. Any noise that could be interpreted as proof that the king had done his duty and that the queen was capable of producing an heir. The morning after, the true horror began. The royal physicians would enter to inspect the evidence. The bedsheets, examined for blood, like a crime scene. Undergarments, checked for stains and traces. Even the bride's body, observed and discussed in chilling detail. In the cold language of court protocol, these inspections were called the proof. But make no mistake, this was not proof of love. This was proof of fertility, obedience, and political usefulness. Imagine being an 18-year-old bride, terrified, trembling, still trying to understand your new husband's moods, and waking up to a group of middle-aged men poking at the sheets where you had just been violated. Your future, your crown, your survival, hanging on whether they found a single stain of blood. If the evidence didn't satisfy them, if the sheets were too clean, if the story didn't align, if the servants heard too little, then suspicion began to spread like wildfire through the palace corridors. Whispers would start. Was she a virgin? Was she lying? Did she deceive the king? And that whisper could become a death sentence. A bride whose proof was questioned faced 3 accusations, any of which could destroy her life: witchcraft, deception, or treason. Because if a queen failed to consummate the marriage, it couldn't be the king's fault. It had to be hers. She must have bewitched him, or betrayed him. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, knew this terror intimately. She arrived in England as a teenage princess, raised to be devout, obedient, and pure. Her first marriage, to Henry's brother Arthur, had already been shadowed by tragedy, and the same obsession with proof. After Arthur's sudden death, Catherine was forced to swear before God that the marriage had never been consummated, so she could legally marry Henry years later. That single question, Was it consummated, haunted her for the rest of her life. Now, as Henry's queen, she faced the same ritual again, the same bed, the same fear, the same humiliating inspection, and this time, failure wasn't an option. The court wanted blood. The kingdom demanded an heir. In Henry's world, a queen's worth was measured by what she could produce, and the wedding night inspection was the first test of that worth. Records show that royal attendants would sometimes keep detailed notes. His Majesty retired with the Queen at 10 of the clock. Sounds of merriment and laughter were heard from within. The bedclothes were inspected the following morning. This was bureaucracy, not romance. And behind the flowery words of Tudor etiquette was a system of surveillance that stripped women of dignity and privacy. But for Catherine, it was more than humiliation. It was terror. She knew the stakes. She knew that the slightest hint of failure could undo everything. The alliance between Spain and England, her mother's reputation, her own life, all of it rested on what happened in that bed. So, when the guards stood outside her chamber, listening, she forced herself to stay silent, terrified that any sound might be misinterpreted. And when the morning came, and the courtiers arrived to verify the evidence, she smiled faintly, trembling, as if to say, "Yes, my king is satisfied. Please don't ask more." But she knew the truth, that nothing she did would ever be enough. These rituals weren't born out of lust. They were born out of control. The Tudor court used the royal bed as a political weapon, to secure alliances, to prove divine favor, to remind everyone that even the body of a queen belonged to the state. Henry believed his power came directly from God, and that meant even his most private acts were matters of national importance. If the king failed in bed, it was not impotence, it was the devil's interference. If the queen displeased him, it was not incompatibility, it was witchcraft. Every moan, every silence, every drop of blood became evidence in a trial that never ended. There are records of servants being rewarded for delivering good news about royal consummations. Others were punished for reporting too little. And so the system fed itself, a machine of gossip, voyeurism, and cruelty, wrapped in the language of faith and loyalty. To the modern mind, it sounds grotesque, but to Henry, it was proof of divine order. He truly believed that God watched his marriage bed, that heaven itself demanded proof that his union was pure and fruitful. For Catherine of Aragon, that belief became a lifelong curse. She bore 6 children and buried 5. Each miscarriage, each stillbirth was treated as evidence of divine displeasure. Each inspection grew harsher. Each failure brought her closer to ruin. And yet, through it all, she endured. Night after night, she entered that room, knowing that what waited behind those carved oak doors wasn't love. It was judgment. Imagine lying in that bed, the tapestries fluttering with the breath of winter air, the sound of guards shifting their armor outside the door. You close your eyes, trying not to think about the eyes and ears pressed against the walls, about the men who will come in the morning to lift the sheets. You try to forget that the entire kingdom is waiting, not for your happiness, but for your proof. That was Catherine's first wedding night. A ritual so public, so cruel, it erased the line between the sacred and the obscene. And this wasn't an exception. It was tradition. Every queen who followed her, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, would face the same surveillance, the same invasion, the same dread that their most private moments were being recorded in history, not as love stories, but as medical reports. They weren't brides. They were subjects of investigation. For Henry, sex was never about intimacy. It was about proof of power. He ruled not just over the land, but over the bodies of women who had been turned into instruments of his ego. The wedding night was his courtroom, the bed his throne, and the sheets his verdict. Modern historians sometimes laugh about the superstitions of Tudor England, the belief that God would punish a nation through a barren queen. But for the women who lived it, it was no superstition. It was daily life. It was the knowledge that every time they undressed, every time they were summoned, every time the king reached for them, they were stepping into a trial they could never win. Catherine of Aragon lasted the longest. She survived humiliation, miscarriages, and Henry's growing obsession with another woman, Anne Boleyn. But the scars of that first night never left her. In private letters, she wrote of sleepless nights, of trembling hands, of praying for God to strengthen my body and my mind. To the court she remained dignified, the perfect queen. But inside she was a woman who had been turned into evidence. That was the true horror of Henry's bedroom. Not the violence, not even the blood, but the loss of humanity. The idea that something as personal as love could be transformed into a political ritual of surveillance and shame. It's easy to dismiss these stories as relics of a barbaric age, but the echoes remain. Every system that measures worth through obedience, every society that strips privacy in the name of order, carries a shadow of Henry's bedroom. By the end of that first night, the sheets had been inspected. The physicians had written their notes. The guards had reported their sounds. And the queen, trembling, smiling through the terror, had learned her first lesson of royal marriage. In Henry's court, love wasn't private. It was evidence. But that was only the beginning. Because after the proof came the punishment. And for Henry's wives, the real torture began when the lights went out. But the real torture began after the proof. Once a queen had passed the public trial of the wedding night, she entered something far worse. A private prison, disguised as a marriage. Because in Henry VIII's court, refusal was treason. No matter her pain, her fear, or the rotting condition of the man beside her, a queen's duty was to obey. It didn't matter if her body was bruised, if her heart recoiled in disgust. The law, unwritten but absolute, declared that when the king summoned his wife to his bed, she came. There was no no. There was no hesitation. Even a pause, a flinch, could be reported as evidence of betrayal. Imagine the knock at the door, late at night, the air thick with the smell of tallow candles and sickness. A messenger, bowing low. His Majesty requests your presence. Every queen understood what that message meant. The summons could never be denied. She would rise, cloak herself in silk, and walk through corridors thick with the scent of incense. Not for beauty, but to conceal another, far less pleasant odor. Behind the heavy velvet curtains of the royal chamber, Henry VIII awaited her. By this stage of his life, the once magnificent King of England was no longer the shining prince of legend. He had become a fading monument to excess and illness. The man who had once impressed all of Europe with his youth and vitality was now a shadow of himself. His body had grown enormous, his legs swollen and painful, the result of years of neglect and disease. The air around him was heavy with the smell of ointments and old wounds, and each movement sent waves of pain through his frame. Yet whenever the king desired company, the entire court hurried to ready his chamber, lighting candles, burning perfumes, and changing linens, all in an effort to hide the unmistakable scent of decay. The king was ready, and the queen had no choice. Contemporary physicians described his leg ulcers as great cankers that oozed corruption. His attendants used wads of cloth soaked in rosewater and vinegar to absorb the discharge, but the smell always won. When the heat of the chamber mixed with infection, the air turned thick, part sweat, part death. And into that room, every wife was summoned, not as a partner, but as a duty, a royal obligation. The guards outside the door heard everything, not out of curiosity, but because it was their job to record the king's activity. They noted how long he remained awake, whether there were sounds of satisfaction, whether the queen left smiling or pale. Behind those stone walls, even silence was suspicious. For the women who lay beside him, each night was an act of survival. Anne Boleyn had once spoken boldly, playfully, teasing the king's ego, but even she learned to fear the bed. Jane Seymour, the quiet one, died soon after childbirth. Some whispered she had simply lost the will to return to him. And then came Anne of Cleves, the woman who discovered, too late, that marriage to Henry meant lying beside a corpse that still believed itself a god. When Anne first met Henry, she was told he was charming, strong, the image of royal masculinity. But the reality was grotesque. He waddled toward her, red-faced, sweating, his leg wrapped in bandages that leaked through his hose. The smell hit her before his voice did. Still, she smiled, because smiling was survival. On their wedding night, the courtiers gathered as usual, bowing as the couple entered the bedchamber. The door shut, the guards took their places outside, and Anne of Cleves faced the man she was now bound to please. Henry tried to kiss her. She froze. The stories say she closed her eyes and turned away, not out of arrogance, but from the overwhelming stench, the odor of rot and ointment, of disease masked with musk. When his lips touched her skin, she held her breath, silently counting the seconds until it would be over. The king, humiliated, pulled back. He told his attendants the next morning that he liked her not, but he didn't tell them why, that she had recoiled from his decay. To Henry, her reaction wasn't disgust, it was disobedience. And disobedience meant insult to the crown. The court physicians were soon summoned, not to examine him, that would be treason, but to examine her. Was she too cold? Too unresponsive? Had she bewitched him? The whispers began immediately. Perhaps the German lady carries a curse. Anne of Cleves was lucky. The king annulled the marriage on the grounds of non-consummation. She escaped with her life and a fortune. But even in freedom, she never spoke publicly of that night. Some said she could still recall the sound of him breathing, the weight of his decaying body beside her, the way she had to press scented cloths to her nose to keep from vomiting. For the others, there was no escape. Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was barely 17 when she was summoned to his bed. He was 50. She called him "my rose without thorns." He called her my jewel of youth. But inside that room it was not affection, it was command. His body was failing, yet his appetite for control grew worse. Catherine obeyed. She kissed the festering leg because he demanded it. She told him he smelled of strength because truth was dangerous. Servants who helped her dress before those nights reported she wept silently. One lady-in-waiting recalled seeing bruises that Catherine couldn't explain. The king's weight, his hands, his fury, all left their marks. And still she smiled at breakfast, greeting courtiers as if nothing had happened. Because in Henry's court, to flinch was to die. Modern psychologists would call it coercion, abuse, trauma. But in the 16th century it was simply marriage. A queen's body was property of the crown, and the crown belonged to Henry. He had rewritten not only England's religion, but the rules of intimacy itself. He believed that his will was divine. So when he desired, God desired. When he demanded, heaven approved. And when a queen hesitated, she wasn't defying a man. She was defying God's anointed king. That's why refusal equaled treason. There are records of Henry flying into rages when a wife took too long to appear at his summons. He would slam his cane against the floor, shouting for attendants. "Bring her! Now!" If she delayed, spies reported it. If she trembled, physicians called it female instability. Every reaction was documented, analyzed, and stored in the palace gossip that fueled his paranoia. Even the way a queen walked into the bedchamber was scrutinized. Too slow, disobedience. Too fast, desperation. Too quiet, guilt. Too cheerful, deceit. There was no right way to please a dying tyrant convinced of his own perfection. The scene repeated, night after night. The heavy curtains drawn, the guards at their posts, the smell of decay mingling with perfume, the sound of the king's labored breathing, and the queen, lying still beside him, praying that he would fall asleep quickly, praying that his touch would not tear open the sores that wept beneath his bandages. Because when that happened, the bed filled with the stench of blood and rot. Servants would rush in with cloths to clean it, and the physicians would nod solemnly, pretending it was normal. No one dared speak the truth. The king's body was dying while he still lived. By the late 1540s, his condition was so severe that mechanical pulleys were installed to lift him into bed. He could barely stand. His legs had to be drained daily, wrapped in fresh linen soaked in wine and herbs. He reeked of gangrene. And still, the court maintained the illusion of virility, that the king remained the passionate lion of England. The queens knew better. They endured it. They smiled. They lied. Because to do anything else meant death. It's hard to imagine the psychological toll. To be young, watched, trapped, summoned by a man who could barely move, yet demanded worship. To lie beside him, feeling the mattress dip under the weight of 400 pounds, the heat of fevered skin, the hiss of his breath through infected lungs. To know that if you flinched, if you gagged, if you even looked away, someone outside that door would hear and report. In Henry's bed, even silence had ears. Anne of Cleves survived by refusing to resist. Catherine Howard died for being too human, for seeking affection elsewhere. Catherine Parr, his final wife, learned the art of pretending. She read to him. She prayed with him. She endured him. And when his infected leg burst one night, covering the sheets in blood and pus, she called for help calmly, hiding her revulsion. Later, she was heard whispering to a servant, "I thank God I still live." That was victory, survival through obedience. So when people romanticize the Tudors, the velvet gowns, the gold, the music, they forget the smell. They forget the locked doors, the fear, the sound of armored boots outside the bedchamber. They forget that queens once lay beside a king whose body was rotting, while the world praised him as God's chosen ruler. This was not passion. It was punishment. Not love, but law. And inside that law, every woman who bore the title of queen became a prisoner in her own bed. In Henry's court, the nightmare was routine. The smell, the orders, the inspections, all of it normal. And when the palace woke the next morning, servants sweeping the corridors and courtiers exchanging forced smiles, it was as if nothing had happened. Because in Henry's England, horror was ordinary, pain was policy, and obedience was survival. Or as one courtier later wrote with chilling simplicity, in Henry's court, it was just Tuesday. But for his wives, survival meant something even worse than submission: fertility. Because once they escaped the stench of the king's bed, they faced another kind of terror entirely: the race to produce a son before the king's patience ran out. But for Henry's wives, survival meant something even worse than submission: fertility. A queen's only true purpose was to produce a son. Not a daughter, not just any child, but a healthy, living male heir who could carry the Tudor bloodline. Every breath she took, every glance she cast toward her husband, every bite of food that passed her lips was judged by that single, merciless expectation. In the eyes of Henry VIII, a woman's worth began and ended in the cradle of a son. The moment the wedding sheets were declared proved, the clock began to tick. The court waited, whispering, counting the months. And if the queen's belly did not swell quickly enough, questions began to spread like infection. Was she barren? Was she cursed? Was God displeased? To ensure conception, Henry's physicians and priests designed rituals that bordered on madness. The queen's menstrual cycles were recorded by servants and studied by men who barely understood how a woman's body worked. Her meals were dictated by superstition. No apples, no beans, no eels, no foods that were considered cold in the medieval sense. She was told to eat figs for fertility, almonds for strength, and to sleep only on her left side so the child would be male. She was warned not to look at ugly men, not to gaze at dark animals, and not to think unholy thoughts, because even a moment's impurity could taint the child in her womb. The queen's urine was examined in glass jars each morning, held up to candlelight by court physicians who claimed they could read pregnancy from color and bubbles. Her pulse was checked, her skin tone noted. Even her dreams were interpreted like omens. A dream of water meant life. A dream of blood meant death. And God help her if she dreamed of the moon. It was said to foretell infertility. But that wasn't all. The queen's chambers became a sanctum of false hope. Midwives and apothecaries brought powders made from crushed pearls, deer antler, or even ground-up toads, claiming each could open the womb. The women drank them obediently, their stomachs twisting in pain, too afraid to question the king's healers. Some of these potions contained mercury or lead. They were slowly poisoning the very women they were meant to heal. Pleasure was never part of the equation. In fact, pleasure was suspicious. If the queen seemed to enjoy herself, she was accused of being experienced. Too experienced. Whispers would start about other lovers, about a sinful nature unworthy of bearing the king's heir. If she showed no enthusiasm, she was called cold, broken, incapable of inspiring divine fertility. There was no winning. Every gesture, every sigh, every look became evidence of guilt. Henry's court believed the female body was a mirror of the soul. A modest, obedient woman would conceive easily. A vain or deceitful one would be punished with miscarriages. So when a queen lost a child, the court didn't mourn. They looked for someone to blame. Catherine of Aragon knew that pain better than anyone. She carried Henry's hopes and his kingdom in her womb 6 times. She buried 5 of those hopes. Each loss was another chisel strike against her crown. After each miscarriage, the priests told her to pray harder, confess more. The doctors prescribed new potions. The king turned away in disgust. In the silent nights that followed, she would kneel before the Virgin Mary, begging for forgiveness she didn't owe. She had done everything right, followed every ritual, every superstition, every humiliating examination, and still God had taken her children. She wasn't alone. Anne Boleyn suffered the same fate, only under the brighter light of Henry's obsession. When Anne first met Henry, she was witty, brilliant, alive. She promised him sons. He promised her the world. But when her belly swelled and then flattened again with each lost pregnancy, the world turned cold. Henry raged through the palace, blaming witchcraft. He claimed Anne had bewitched his body into weakness. The same passion that once enthralled him now became proof of sin. Servants were ordered to burn the Queen's gowns, her letters, even her favorite perfume, because it was said to contain sorcery. Anne's final miscarriage came after she had carried the child for months. Some say it was a boy. Some say she saw the blood and fainted before she even called for help. In the darkness of her chamber, she pressed her hands against her belly, whispering apologies to the life slipping away. The court recorded it clinically, like a failed experiment. But those who served her remembered the sound of her sobbing, low and broken, echoing through the stone halls long after midnight. No one comforted her. No one dared. To speak of grief was to question God's will, and by extension, the king's. So Anne faced her loss alone, the same way Catherine had. Both women, once adored, became ghosts haunting their own palaces. By now, Henry's paranoia had curdled into delusion. He believed God spoke through the womb. Every miscarriage was a divine message that he'd chosen the wrong woman. Every stillbirth was a warning from heaven that the queen was cursed. And so he turned his wrath upon them. First Catherine, then Anne, then Jane, then the next and the next. Each new wife expected to succeed where the last had failed. The rituals grew more invasive. Physicians ordered the queens to sleep with the windows sealed to keep bad air from poisoning the womb. They forbade them from bathing during certain moon phases. They measured how much the queen laughed, how often she prayed, how long she ate. Some even claimed a woman's voice could harm a fetus if she spoke too loudly. Every moment of their lives became medical theater. Each morning, servants would report on the queen's appetite, her complexion, her moods. The king demanded updates as if reviewing military reports. Has she felt movement? Has she taken her tonic? Every no brought silence, a silence more dangerous than anger. And yet, the irony was unbearable. Henry's own body was the real cause. Years of infection, obesity, and injury had likely left him nearly infertile. But no one could speak that truth. It was treason even to think it. So the blame always returned to the Queen, the vessel that had failed God. Catherine of Aragon aged under that weight. The woman who once rode horses and laughed at court balls grew pale and fragile. When she lost her final child, Henry declared the marriage cursed and sought a new bride. He told the world that Catherine had deceived him from the beginning, that her womb was barren by sin. She was exiled, left to die alone in a cold castle, clutching the crucifix that was once her crown. Anne Boleyn followed her, only faster, only bloodier. Her failure to produce a son gave Henry the excuse he needed to erase her. He accused her of adultery, of witchcraft, of seducing his men. The same bed where he once whispered love became a place of interrogation. Every private word, every touch, every rumor was turned into evidence. Within weeks, she went from queen to prisoner, from the mother of his unborn son to a headless ghost on the Tower Green. The cycle repeated, wife after wife. Each woman arrived to heal him, to redeem him, to give England the heir he craved. Each one learned too late that fertility was not a blessing, but a trap. When they conceived, they were saints. When they didn't, they were witches. The court itself became a breeding laboratory. Doctors mixed herbs, priests offered blessings, astrologers charted the stars to choose the perfect night for conception. They even placed holy relics under the royal bed, pieces of saints' bones, scraps of the true cross, believing divine favor could quicken the womb. The Queen's chamber smelled of incense and medicine, of desperation disguised as faith. And through it all, pleasure was forbidden. The act that created life was stripped of tenderness, turned into a medical ritual overseen by invisible judges. Queens learned to hold their breath, to lie still, to pray that this time, maybe, God would be merciful. But mercy never came. When Catherine of Aragon lost her last pregnancy, she stopped speaking for days. Servants found her on the floor beside her bed, her rosary tangled in her fingers, her voice gone. When Anne Boleyn miscarried, she stared at the blood on her hands and whispered, "The king will kill me for this." And he did. Their grief was too private for history books, too raw for royal records. But it lingered in the silence of those rooms, in the cold stone that once heard the sound of their weeping. By then, even the most loyal courtiers knew the truth. The royal bed was no longer a place of love. It had become a laboratory of pain, a prison of superstition, where science, faith, and fear twisted together into cruelty. The women of Henry's court were not wives. They were experiments. Their bodies measured, their souls tested, their failures punished. And yet, through all the anguish, through the blood and the prayers, they still tried to believe that if they could just give him a son, all the torment would end. It never did, because even worse than pain was the smell of death itself. But even worse than pain was the smell of death itself. By the final years of Henry VIII's reign, the King of England was rotting alive. His once magnificent body, celebrated for its strength and power, had become a landscape of decay. Chunks of flesh sloughed from his legs when the ulcers burst. His veins carried poison, His breath carried infection, and his very skin oozed with the scent of death. Those who came near him described the air as heavy, foul, and metallic, like the smell before a slaughter. Inside the royal bedchamber, that stench clung to everything: the sheets, the curtains, the walls, even the gold-threaded tapestries. No perfume could hide it. Servants burned herbs and myrrh until the smoke turned the room gray, but the rot seeped through, sour and relentless. It was the smell of a kingdom decaying from its core. The king could barely walk, yet he demanded to be treated as the same virile monarch who had once charmed Europe. He was lifted into bed by pulleys, his massive frame trembling with pain as attendants adjusted the cushions beneath him. Each movement risked tearing open the sores on his legs, releasing streams of pus that soaked the linen. When he groaned, the whole court froze, and when he desired a queen, no one dared to remind him of his condition. Catherine Parr, his sixth and final wife, learned quickly that love was not what he sought. It was obedience. She was clever, gentle, and cautious. She read to him from scripture when he was lucid, and when he was not, she smiled and waited for his rage to pass. But nothing could prepare her for the nights when the king called for her to share his bed. By then, the royal physicians had created elaborate rituals to mask the king's decay. They rubbed his body with ointments of rose, musk, and wine, each one meant to hide the infection. The servants changed the sheets 3 times a day. The queen's maids would perfume her hair and hands before she entered, so she could endure the smell. She carried a square of linen soaked in amber and cinnamon oil, pressing it against her nose whenever the air grew unbearable. When Catherine Parr entered the royal bedchamber, she stepped into a tomb disguised as a palace. The heavy velvet curtains trapped the heat and stench. The king's skin was gray and bloated, his eyes glassy from pain and drink. And yet, when she approached, he tried to smile. A grotesque grin stretched over a face that no longer looked human. The act itself was not passion, but obligation. The king's body had become an instrument of torment. His ulcers, wrapped tightly in linen, would rupture under pressure, spilling blood and pus onto the sheets. The physicians waiting outside would rush in afterward to clean and rebandage him, while the queen sat motionless, silent, her face composed. No one spoke of what happened in those hours. No one dared. To live with Henry VIII was to breathe death. Every cough, every wound, every meal could carry disease. The palace was filled with whispers of contagion. Some believed his body was cursed. Others said it was God's punishment for his sins. But Henry believed otherwise. He saw his suffering as proof of divine favor, a test from God to strengthen his soul. And so he continued, demanding loyalty, demanding worship, demanding wives who would love him while the world held its breath against the stench of his decay. What made it worse was the surveillance. Privacy did not exist in the royal bedchamber. There were rumors, confirmed by courtiers and chroniclers, that peepholes had been cut into the walls. Trusted attendants, spies loyal to the crown, were ordered to watch through those holes, to make sure the king's authority was respected, even in his most private acts. Some called it the king's security. Others called it what it truly was: hell's eye. Peepholes in hell. The spies recorded everything. The timing, the sounds, the behavior of the queen. If she appeared disgusted, it was written down. If she hesitated, it was noted. Even a look of pity could be dangerous. These reports were passed to the council, to Cromwell or his successors, who used them as ammunition if the king ever turned against his wife. The royal bed was no longer a place of intimacy. It was an interrogation chamber with velvet sheets. By the time Catherine Parr became queen, she knew what had happened to the women before her. She knew about Anne Boleyn's laughter, twisted into a charge of adultery. She knew about Catherine Howard's smile, used as proof of betrayal. She knew that even a whisper could kill. Henry's paranoia had consumed him entirely. He trusted no one, not his ministers, not his friends, not even his wives. Spies lingered in every corridor, reporting the smallest gestures. If the queen looked too happy, they said she plotted with another man. If she looked too sad, they said she despised the king. There was no safety, not even in silence. The paranoia extended beyond the bedroom. Rumors became weapons. A servant's casual remark could become a confession under torture. Anne Boleyn's downfall began with nothing more than gossip about her charm. One court musician, accused of sleeping with her, was tortured until he screamed confessions that made no sense. Her brother was executed for a crime no one believed possible, incest, invented to justify her death. It all began with whispers about her power over the king's body. Years later, Catherine Howard met the same fate. She was young, radiant, and terrified. When Henry summoned her, she obeyed. When he grew suspicious, she begged. But it was too late. Her past lovers were hunted, tortured, and broken. The girl who once kissed life into a dying king was dragged to the Tower, accused of treason and impurity. They say she practiced laying her head on the block before the executioner's blade fell. Her last words were not about sin, but fear. Fear of the king's anger. Fear of what would come after. By the time Catherine Parr took her place beside Henry, she had learned from their ghosts. She knew how to speak to him without provoking rage, how to smile without looking too eager, how to touch him without revealing revulsion. She became the perfect illusion, a mirror reflecting his power back at him. And for that, she survived. But survival came at a price. Each night she lay beside a man who could barely breathe, his chest heaving, his skin damp and feverish. When his ulcers burst, she stayed still. When he moaned in pain, she whispered prayers. The smell was indescribable, a mixture of decay and human heat. More than once she left the chamber at dawn, pale and shaking, pressing the perfumed cloth to her lips to keep from retching. Even the physicians grew numb to the horror. They treated his wounds like sacred relics, as if tending to a saint's suffering. No one dared say the obvious, that the king's body was dying, and his mind had gone with it. Instead, they told him he looked strong, that his wounds were healing, that his wives adored him. Lies became the air they breathed. Outside those walls, England trembled. The people saw the bloated king carried through the palace on a wheeled chair, his face hidden beneath a veil, his crown gleaming above a body that could no longer stand. But inside, in the silent corridors, the truth was far darker. He was a man who no longer ruled a nation, only his fears. As his body failed, his paranoia grew sharper. He accused servants of plotting poison. He ordered the execution of friends he'd known for decades. He signed death warrants from his bed, the ink smudged by shaking hands. His court became a graveyard of loyalty, every favor repaid in blood. And through it all, the queens bore the weight of his madness. They were forced to smile, to comfort the monster he had become, to pretend they saw a king where there was only a corpse. The royal bedchamber had become a chamber of horrors, disease, fear, and death swirling together under the banner of divine right. When Henry finally died in 1547, the palace fell silent. The stench that had haunted it for years began to fade, replaced by the faint sweetness of the herbs they burned to purify the room. Catherine Parr outlived him by barely a year. Some said she never recovered from the nightmares, the smell, the fear, the feeling of being watched even in sleep. The courtiers who served under Henry whispered for generations about those final nights. Some claimed that when the king took his last breath, a black mist rose from his body and drifted across the room. Others said the sound of flies filled the chamber. None of them ever forgot the smell. The story of Henry VIII has been told as one of politics, power, and reformation. But the truth, buried beneath centuries of ceremony, is far more grotesque. It is the story of a man who turned love into punishment, intimacy into politics, and faith into fear. It is the story of women who were forced to worship a rotting God, because the world told them his will was divine. The man who ruled by divine right turned love into horror. And when the candles finally burned out, when the palace walls no longer echoed with his rage, England awoke to the silence left behind, a silence that smelled faintly of decay. If these truths disturb you, then you are finally seeing history without its mask. This isn't just history. This is pure horror. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.